Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Patreon tutorial video. For this month's video, I wanted to try something a bit more unusual, something that we haven't quite done before, and that is to do a systematic explanation slash breakdown of how you could revisit an old piece to improve it. So this one's pretty interesting because, well, I've definitely revisited previous pieces and really had fun with updating them, checking out where things could be improved, and all those little things. So I thought, why not just share it with you guys and to really kind of showcase how small little changes, or rather small, relatively physically small changes, can make a really big impact on the grand scale of things. So yeah, I think that would be quite an interesting topic to touch on, and hopefully you could also make use of whatever we talk about today in your own works. And towards the end, I'd like to invite you guys to once again, it's been a while, to submit your personal work and a personal, or rather a recent update of your old personal work. And we can take a look at that together and really just look at how you guys have also improved in ways since you started drawing. And yeah, but more on that later. For now, let's take a look at the piece we'll be using for as an example today. So this is the piece in question, now with the rain effects on. So I really like this piece when I first drew it. I think it's pretty interesting. I like the dynamic movement. I like, a lot of things about the piece, right? But looking back at it, some of it feels kind of unfinished, as if the potential was there, but it just, didn't have enough attention, didn't have enough love, and, it's kind of feeling a little bit unfinished in certain ways. So for today, we'll be taking a look at this piece as an example to see how we can look out for specific areas, specific types of changes that we can make to update or upgrade a piece from perhaps a more intermediate or beginner level to a more finished level, right? And I think hopefully it'll be helpful for you guys to see how certain decisions are made, certain changes are incorporated, and yeah. And without further ado, let us begin. So to begin, let's take a look at a character and sort of think about it in different parts, right? There are multiple ways to approach this. So for this character, because the general pose as a whole is pretty okay, there are no major adjustments on that front, I want to break things down, part by part, so we can have a pretty organized and easier time to, to look at it. And to begin, let's take a look from let's start with the character's head, right? Followed by the arms, and then the legs and torso. In no specific order, but we'll try to tackle them one at a time. So, beginning with the character's head. So, a couple of things here, right? So for this particular piece, we want to kind of reorient ourselves, which can be important. For example, here we're drawing a character who is facing away, right? So this part of the face is kind of compressed with the ear that's sort of here. And the neck is kind of here. We're drawing it is sort of this kind of view, right? Where we see quite little of the head and face, maybe a little bit more than what I'm showing in this example. But it is not a, for example, it's not a straight on view, right? It's something a bit towards from the middle, but slightly backwards, or slightly from the back. So with that in mind, what are some of the things here that are a little bit inconsistent with that? And firstly, I think the mask could be an issue. But before that, let's take a look at the lips, right? The character's lips are, firstly a bit oddly shaped and really rough. So what we can do is to start defining their shape. Or rather, for the context of this particular piece, what I need to do is to start defining their shape a little bit. Kind of cut out the silhouette a little bit more clearly. Right, let me duplicate this old piece so we can paint it on the same layer. And really just kind of scale this up because this area here feels a little bit too small. Now we can sort of cut away the unnecessary areas. And make the change like so. So now we have the one with a sharper scale, and now we have a cleaner silhouette. So one of the things that you might find as you revisit old works is that some areas aren't painted as clearly as they could be. So this is an interesting thing, right? Because normally we think of older, artworks essentially being essentially containing more mistakes, but rather sometimes it isn't so much a complete mistake, but rather that we don't know exactly how to paint something, so we leave it a little bit rough, or rather we don't know where the source of the error is, so we kind of try and mess around with it and try to find a solution, but sometimes you don't really find it, and all you do is to mess around a bit, and then you end up with something rough. That we started with, right? The character's lips were left a little bit too rough from before. So to begin, let us sort of remedy that, and then do a little bit of shading to account for the form, right? Remember, the face is sort of looking away from us, like so, right? It's not head on. Once again. And then because of that, right, this part of the lip is going to be a lot more facing towards us, so it kind of gets this almost bevel-like lighting, right? So it gets a bit of a highlight on this area compared to here, right? And because all this area here is under the mask, it can be a little bit darker. So if we look at the character's eyes, this is also interesting, right? Because the horizon line is somewhere around here, so we're below this particular area here. So because we're below, one thing kind of think of on eyes, and let's say you're drawing an eye like this, right? An eye is kind of looking like this, and it's a very angry character. And then the eyelashes kind of do this, right? The eyelashes don't stop above the iris, right? Eyelashes go all the way, to both sides of, the middle of the eye. Pretty self-explanatory, like no one's looking at this and saying, oh my goodness, how could this be possible? But, an important reminder here, because this is how, without the side eyelashes is how we drew our current drawing, because this area here kind of terminates. And so to remedy that, what we can do is to draw a couple of eyelashes here. Recall the perspective, right? We're looking at this from below. So because we're looking at this from below, we're going to see some of the eyelashes essentially on the other side of the tip of the eye, if that makes sense. So for now, we'll keep it a little bit more simple, nothing too complicated, right? Just to account for that. And we can use a bit of soft brush here to sort of indicate the fold, right? Where your eye is really, really wide open. You get a kind of fold here between the part of your brow or under the brow area that doesn't really bend or the fold, and then you have this area here that kind of folds, right? So kind of differentiation of form here that's important, and then which forms the eyelid, right? This area here forms the eyelid, so we kind of want to make sure we really respect that. And then we can also add a couple more small details here to the eyelashes, right? Same as before. Recall that eye is kind of like this, or an eye is kind of like this, right? So the middle here also kind of goes up. So similar to here, we want the eyelashes to go up just a little bit to kind of to finish that look. Yeah, but otherwise, there isn't that much here. Or one thing that you could also do, for example, right, we have elements like that eyebrow. So the eyebrow is obviously made up of tiny strands of hair. So what could be helpful is just indicating a texture by just stroking through it with a couple of thin lines to kind of break up the texture, break up the even texture, and then you're good to go. Some really simple things that we can, try to add on for this piece. Similarly, this area here, we can tune back the brightness a little bit to make sure, as with before, as with the other areas, we're kind of ensuring that we are staying committed to the previous angle that we have decided on. And for now, I think we can leave the eye area like so. We might come back later, but let's move on to the mask. So the mask is a bit of a it's a bit of an issue, right? As you can see clearly, it's not too great because the forms here are just a bit too confusing. So how do we really fix it, right? Once again, we kind of take note of, this relationship. And then if we look at a mask, we can realize, hey, this area is on a shadow, sure, but what about this area? Should it be so bright, or should it be a bit darker, right? Or do we have the idea of, let's say, we draw the mask as if it's part of the face, like so. So if it's a part of the face, we consider, for example, using forms like this, right? making the mouth area a bit smaller because, you know, from the side, right, the mask isn't that large. To put it simply, the mouth area wouldn't be open so big to the side. You know, it's kind of like a piece of armor. You want some protection from it at least. And then it's importantly, right, for pieces of, you know, armor like this, we want to, as much as possible, let me flip the canvas, we want to, as much as possible, be kind of more sharp with our angles and not too round. And at least like define areas a little bit, like for example with this lip here. And once again, right, this could be a bit difficult, but you know, let us keep trying because I'm also figuring things out on the fly, right? Like what looks good, what kind of looks terrible and needs fixing. And so one thing here I noticed here is that this area here was previously drawn like this, where it should be more like this. Right, to kind of mark the midpoint of the mouth opening, can be something like this. And then same for the bottom portion, the midpoint could be something like this. And then we could sort of cut away this area here as part of the chin. And here's also another important area, right? Because the mask is a very distinct object. It's a kind of like a very organic, sharp object, right? It's not something that's soft. We can also use some highlights for the bottom, like so. Right, the form here is really important because it really conveys a lot of information on what, you know, what's the material of the thing you're drawing. Right? Is it a soft item? Is it a hard item? Is it a hard object? And all those things like that. That is very important. And for now, you know, I still don't think it's quite perfect just yet. It's going to take me a little bit more to sort of nail down how this mask is going to look. But for now, we can leave it like so, right? There's some corrections that we made, but it's not perfect. And here we can alter the silhouette just a little bit to give it a bit of a recurved edge, just for a bit more visual interest in this area here. Now, where would a mask end, right? I would imagine the mask would be something like so. Right, the mask will be something like that. So we can sort of recurve it like this. And then for now, we can leave it like this. Next, we can look at things like the feature like this unicorn horn. I like the little angle that I made here earlier on, or rather years ago. Right, I think this angle is really nice. It's a nice little recurve. So let's sharpen it a bit and continue making use of it. Once again, remember, right? I think sometimes when we like to go through certain things for the sake of changing it, it's not always the ideal plan, right? One of the best ways to really look at things is in perspective. So if you're from an under or a low angle perspective, we kind of want to remind ourselves, even though we're painting, you know, we're painting up here, right? They were seeing this area from below. So from below, what would this area look like? And those are some of the considerations that you can take into account as you paint. Right, for example, this area here is taking some bounce light from below. So we're gonna give it this look. And importantly, right, we want this to sort of be like an ornament on the character's head, right? She's not actually growing horns. So we can kind of include some additional structures, perhaps, on the top of the head to sort of reinforce that particular idea or visual image. For example, something like this could work for now. Once again, lots of for nows, right? Because just as with drawing a new piece, sometimes we make changes in old pieces like this. You kind of really want to pay attention to how things are changing, whether things are working together as they should, or are they, you know, kind of just not really fitting well. So next, we want to kind of figure out the hair of the character. Right, for example, the hair, once again, right, we're looking at the character slightly from behind, so we kind of want to have this sort of effect on the hair. If you follow my new lines, right, you kind of want the proximal elements to be overlapping the distal elements. it's a fancy word for saying that the hair that's nearest to us should be overlapping the hair that's a little bit further away. So that effect code is really helpful in indicating, you know, where exactly we're seeing something from. And that's something that we could incorporate here, for example. I do apologize, but sometimes I see small things that's, oh yeah, that's an error that we can fix. And I just kind of jump to it. And here, as you can see, I'm looking at the eye of the character and drawing it a bit more in perspective, right? Because eye is kind of like this, right? It's, you know, to simply put it, it's kind of like this, right? Like this is sort of the shape of the eye. It's kind of sunken in, right? The colored part on the, or rather the center dark part of the eye is kind of sunken in into this colorful part. And then rather than drawing it, you know, like this, where it's in the middle and it's kind of like a flat plane, you can draw it like this. But from an angle, it's going to look something like this, right? Where you see a lot of this particular area, but very little of this area. So this is the kind of effect I'm going for here. And that's going to help things look a bit more convincing. As you can see, you know, just me adding more contours to certain things that I just spotted. And yeah, continue to make edits like that. It's really the way that, you know, the rest of this process is going to go. But as you can see, a lot of my current changes aren't massive. They aren't like, my goodness, let's redo this whole area here. But rather, it's just really some small things to conform important elements. I think that's key, to conform more important elements within the piece to the correct perspective, to the correct volume and shape. And for example here, right, recall once again how we position our character's head. Because of this, the eyebrows, you know, they aren't a decal that's stuck onto your brow, right? Your eyebrow hair. They are really kind of protruding out a little bit, so we kind of want to give them that little bit of extra volume. And so here we go. I'm gonna give them a little bit of extra volume here. Yeah, and kind of make them part of the silhouette, right? I think that's pretty important when you're drawing things from this angle. That's gonna make things just a bit more convincing. And yeah, okay, so, you know, back to the hair. So for the character's hair, some of the issue here is that the hair is really just incomplete, right? Because if we look at the drawing as a whole, you know, and then we throw in a bunch of texture here. It's like, yeah, you know, it's fine. You know, there's motion. It follows the rest of the piece. It's okay. But if we look at it closely, we'll notice that it's really, really unfinished, right? Like, what is this blob here? There's a big direction. There's kind of a direction as to how it's going, but it's really not clear enough for it to be, you know, ready to be shipped per se as a drawing. So let us start thinking about how we can sharpen these. So a good way to approach this kind of things is silhouette first. So silhouette first, meaning we want the big shapes to be done first, right? Rather than going in here and say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 strands, we don't want to do that just yet. I want to look at the big shapes here and go, okay, so this part, this particular strand here, let us sharpen it into, let's say, this shape, right? I'm going to sharpen it into this shape. Okay, now this part is done, right? What about here? For this particular strand here, how do we want to paint it? Maybe we want to go for a bit of a bigger shape first, right? Like so. We can use a thicker brush to sort of dictate this area first. Like this, and then let's say, how does this strand come about? Right, perhaps something like this. Right, so this just roughly, you know, kind of going over areas with a complete line, right? This is going to be very helpful as well, because this is going to help you add a bit of flow to certain things that may be missing flow. And this will be very helpful when you're looking for ways to, you know, complete certain shapes or refresh yourself on why certain shapes are there. And yeah. And so, for example, sometimes, right, when I feel like, okay, the lines are a little bit too much, you know, we can remove them. The idea is that we want to help them, we want to use them to help us visualize what is going on. So for now, another issue that seems to be appearing is that I feel like this area is a little bit too dense, right? There's no room at all for, you know, whatever underneath the hair to be visible. So we kind of want to rectify that a bit. Recall our mask here, or rather recall our intended or our intended shape of the mask there, something like this, right? So maybe we could just show a little bit of it under the hair. Right, just a little bit of it to break up the one huge block. That could be good. And for now, right, we can leave it as such. And we can leave it as such, like so. And then for large elements like this particular hairband, right, we want to keep things kind of straight. Because here, you know, what is this line here? What is this like, what is this thing here, right? It's really just out of place. It's not, it doesn't belong to the value of the hair, doesn't belong to the value of the headband. So we kind of want to clean that up. So these things are pretty small, but also really important as well, right? Because we're looking to draw this particular area here, right? It's the head area. It's really important in character illustrations. As I'm sure you guys have known, if you have been around for a while, I always like to talk about, you know, how focal areas require more attention, and you know, sometimes that's just the way it is. You can't really get away from it, and you have to kind of pay your tribute almost to these areas, have to spend the time and energy to sort of really fix them up. And so this is the sort of work that we are doing right now. And similarly, right, as with before, we can also use Liquify. As I like to often mention, Liquify is a great tool because it allows us to make adjustments like this without having to paint over entire areas completely. And this is really, really helpful, especially when we have multiple forms that we want to be able to flow. We want them to flow. We don't want them to, you know, they're not disparate blocks or rather very inorganic shaped blocks that can be difficult to manage with a Liquify tool, but rather soft and curved lines, which are perfect for a Liquify tool to really help us make some good corrections here, right? Like so. And the one thing you can also consider is the volume of the hair. So the volume of the hair is also interesting because a lot of times we talk, well, rather in lots of tutorials, we see people talking about volume of the hair. Treat each one like a banana, for example. And while that is definitely true, and I think that's actually a pretty good cue to think of strands of hair, is that you definitely want to give them something other than just a flat look, right? And so we kind of want to, perhaps on lower opacity, add a bit more brightness to this middle segment. Just with general loose strokes, right? Nothing too, you know, tight or strict, just with some general loose strokes to add a bit of brightness to this area here, or maybe even this under area here, to really up the 3D-ness of the hair that's kind of coming out towards us. However, sometimes, you know, you might feel like, okay, the hair just feels like stuck to the character's face. It's really not, you know, it doesn't feel like it's, for example, if this is the character's head, right? This is the back view of the character's head, right? And let's say the hair is kind of coming backwards like this. So the hair feels like it's all sticking to the character's head like this, right? What if we don't want it to be like this, but rather we want it to be like this? So this is one of the things that's a bit harder to show from an angle because, well, you know, we're in this angle. The tendency is for things like this to look a bit flat, but if we, you know, recall the thing that I just deleted, rather than having the hair be like this, we want the hair to be like this, right? A bit more puffing out. The best way the best thing we can do is to, you know, lend this area a bit more highlight, right? So this could be one of the things that we have not noticed, right? Because the head here will apply rather even values across this entire region. This particular form here, it's a bit too loose. So what I like to do is to just go and really, really roughly take a bright value, doesn't matter what it is, and kind of just dabble it in a little bit at a time. Just dabble it in, you know, this area with the headband as well, right? Want to kind of brighten that up just a little bit. And what this is going to do is help restore the amount of value, or rather restore the correct lighting to this particular area that we can, and then we can continue working on the piece. So these are just some form corrections, followed by, you know, a lot of additional painting that we will be doing for this particular area. Similarly, overlaps are also pretty useful here, right? Making sure our overlaps are clear. For example, we can overlap elements that are behind the hair. That would be even better, right? To really show how it's distanced or rather spaced away from certain other elements. and then to have strands that are more independent per se. I think that also be good as well. Right, separate from the main body, but following the flow of the main body, right? That could be good. And stuff like that. And yeah, moving on next, let's look at the back portion of the hair, which is also in a bit of a mess. For this area here, we also want to start by tackling sort of the silhouette area. Something like this is very helpful. Right, kind of identify areas where we could do with very minor sharpening of shapes. This is especially important when we have clear silhouettes like this, and when they're in a focal area, right? As with before, focal areas are really important. They need to be respected and kept sharpened, right? So here we go. Really, my focus right now is just on making sure every sort of finishing edge, or rather part of the silhouette, is clean, right? There are no stragglers, or rather there are no stragglers which aren't finished looking, right? Which are, you know, incomplete, like this blob here. Right? That's not too great. That's not what we need, and stuff like that. Similarly, the top of the head, right, where a lot of light and therefore attention is placed, right, we can also think about it a little bit more. For example, how would the hair respond to being, say, you know, pushed down by a hairband, right? It will kind of bounce back up, right? To take account the volume of the hair, you know, the hair sort of bounces back up. It might even overlap a little of this headband area here, because once again, we're looking at the character from slightly behind. These are the things that will happen. And what I also like to do is to just grab shapes like this and throw in a dark shadow, because that is sort of really a great way to just indicate, okay, so this particular area here is bulging above, or rather is kind of popping out above the rest, right? Indicates a little bit of form here and there. This is particularly great when you absolutely need to showcase form, and you know you don't want to be noodling around for too long. So you can kind of use this kind of options here to sort of speed things up a bit, right? Obviously, you might want to make them a bit more subtle as, you know, drawing progresses, but we can begin with things being kind of rough like so. Similarly, consider overlaps, whereas the nearest forms are a bit nearer to us, or overlapping the further away forms. Right? Sometimes it could be good to subvert the effect for just a little bit to show, you know, the complexity of the overlap, and it's not just, you know, a really simple overlap. But most of the time, you want to have the majority of the time have the overlap make, you know, direct logical sense, right? Like the thing that's nearer to you covers the thing that is further away from you. So right now, we've got a lot of the small little things adjusted for. However, the overall shape isn't too great, right? Overall flow isn't too great. So what we can do is to start thinking about how we want to introduce the flow. Right? Because the back of the skull is like this, right? The back of the skull is something like this. And right now the hair here feels kind of weak, right? It feels like it's just coming down straight away. So what we can do is to puff them up in a way, almost, by using the liquefy tool. Once again, our hero, really helpful for these soft areas, right, where you can just puff them out. Right, so you can see how they work. And then, for example, if we want to, say, introduce yet more, you know, more direct form, or very obvious cast shadows, or even core shadows in this case, right, we can use use large blocks like this to indicate that, for example, this area here is majority, you know, under or overshadowed by this area here. And then obviously sometimes there might be mistakes or errors in the form, and you can correct them. You can even use a lighter brush to paint over to show higher, or rather a more flatter position strand that isn't so completely overlapped by another hair strand or something like that. Right, and because we're looking at it from below, sort of the small areas on top, they're going to be a bit smaller. The little pieces of, you know, shadow area here, they're going to be a bit smaller as you move upwards. And yeah, we can just keep doing this for a bit. However, sometimes, right, as we draw, we find that sometimes we have some earlier elements that are really getting in our way, right? For example, this particular ornament or this hair tie over here. So what we can always do is to get rid of them first, which is when backup layers come in really helpful. We can get rid of them first, not worry about them right now because, you know, the hair is a priority. We need to fix that first. And then we can kind of reassess the forms like so. Right, and then we can think about the flow a bit more unobstructed. And then how that would function. And then, for example, at some point where we look at it and say, okay, so the hair's kind of in a good spot, let's bring it back. We can always go back to an earlier layer where it's still here, and then we can sort of grab it and bring it back. We can really just bring it back like this, you know, nice, quick, and easy. And then now, because they're in separate layers, we can also paint them separately as well. And so yeah, this is an example for kind of correcting the hair area that we've just done. Of course, still very rough. What I will next do is to, you know, start painting in finer strands for this upper areas here. Once again, right, kind of going through overlaps to help myself figure out, you know, how certain things should be drawn, right? What areas, you know, are hidden, what areas are you know, are being exposed, stuff like that, right? Things also to do with form, right? Lots of things like that to worry about. Also consider, rather than having the hair like this, perhaps some of the hair could be coming out from under the headband, like so, and then making it its way across the headband, the rest of the head like this. Right, a single overlapping strand can be pretty helpful when we want to reinforce the forms. And sometimes we also want to make bigger strokes with a larger pen size if we feel like, okay, this area is getting a bit too hyper detailed for the wrong reasons, right? We can do something like this to, you know, simplify an area rather effectively. And the next, we can take a look at something like the ear, right? For things like this, I like to draw things a little bit more manually, so less of big strokes, but a little bit more precise. Making use of my knowledge of drawing more ears than I have at the time of originally drawing this piece. For example, indicating that this particular area here, right, a little bit of light spills over to the inner fleshy cartilage of the ear. While this area here is a bit darker because it's really compact, right? These pieces here are really stuck to each other, or rather stuck close to this overhang. Apologies for the terrible terminology or non-existent terminology I'm using for anatomy here. My apologies. So, you know, we end up something like this, right? It's not precise, but what's important is that we kind of follow the general flow. And a lot of times with things like ears, we can kind of get away with it because everyone's ears are different. So, you know, as long as you follow the general mold of how things are supposed to go, you can't really go that wrong. So, but the main idea here is that we want it to be at least a little bit sharpened. We don't want it to be too blurred, because once again, it's also in a focal area. It's important that it, keeps at least some of its detail intact. And yeah. And so for little textures like this, where we have little symbols like this, it can be tempting to, really just take it easy with them. But I find that sometimes the viewer's attention really gravitates to these. So it could be good to, at a bare minimum, right? Like for example, we're drawing a symbol like this, to kind of draw them with a little bit more respect, right? Rather than just complete neglect. For example, we could try something like this. That could be an interesting, interesting shape, or rather more interesting shape than what we had before. I throw on just a little bit of highlights here. And then we have something that's a bit more serviceable than where it was before. And so for now, we're kind of done with the head area. There's still a bunch of things to do, right? Like for example, this horn, this particular, cloth bandage that's been tied here, little things like that will continue to continue to paint and resolve, but we'll revisit this later in the interest of time, right? Let's move on to other parts of the character that I think you also find helpful, when I make these corrections, hopefully. And firstly is the shoulder. So the thing about this particular shoulder here, or let's talk about it, the central torso area. The thing about this shoulder here is that it's really exposed and forward. It's really in the light. So sometimes we like to see artists who draw things in a really rough way, and it kind of looks good. But when you try to replicate it, it doesn't look that great. And sometimes the reason is that they might be drawing something that in real life you would see in sort of like a blurry motion if something is moving really, really fast, or it's in a bit of darkness, it's not very well lit, it's hard to see. But, right, as I mentioned before, for those things, we can get away with things being a bit loose. But for elements in focus, like this particular bandaged area, for example, right, I will recommend that we sort of respect it and then give it the correct amount of attention that it requires, right? For example, this arm here is sort of extending forward, so it has a bit of slightly more, so the arm is something like this, right? Right, it's something like this. It's not something like this. So these are really small things that can get lost, because when you're looking at tiny areas like this, right, the big forms sort of get lost, because right now it's something like this. And then something like this, right? The arm is something like, I keep saying something like this, but the important nuance is that you have to pay attention to areas that show a lot of form, a lot of direction, even though they may be small proportionately on canvas, they may be visually small areas. So we kind of want to make sure that we do the wrapping right, because lines like this, right, they're just basically free contour lines we can make use of to make our piece more convincing. So for areas that we expect, to be wet, like, the characters in the rain, right, we can add a little bit of skin tone underneath as a way to show a bit of transparency, and then we can sort of override some of the areas with the color of the bandage, for example, right? Something like this. And then sometimes as we paint, we start to lose the plot a little bit, and then we can unify the colors, or unify the values and colors with sort of like a paint over like this, right? We just want to sort of paint over this area. Notice how I'm ignoring everything around it, because I want to capture this form as a whole. I do not want to, be like, oh, steer clear of this area, and then, in return, or rather as a result, messing up the area that I'm actually, intending on painting really, really sharply here. And so, yeah, that's sort of the answer, or that's sort of the kind of consideration that we want to make. Now, of course, right, because of the backup layer, we can sort of restore what we have in the surroundings pretty easily. Yeah, we can restore the surroundings pretty easily, and we have a much cleaner shoulder area. However, sometimes, right, for example, after flipping, we notice that, okay, so the shoulder is a little bit too small. What are we gonna do? Well, another solution, for example, for me, myself, I feel like it's a bit more organic for me to just use liquefy and expand it this way. Now, everyone's going to have a different way, right? For example, because I now have the contour lines, I can get a clearer look at where things are when I, kind of do this liquefy style of correction. It's really, once again, very good for organic objects because you do not need to maintain any, straight edge or stuff like that. This is really, really good, right? And it can essentially bring the shoulder up to its correct size. And with the shoulder on its correct size, we can continue working on the piece itself. Right, once again, right, if we need to restore the other more rigid areas around it, we can always do this. And kind of correct out these small mistakes here. The idea is really to prioritize form, as we mentioned before, right? So for the shoulder here, this is sort of the idea that I also want to carry through. Now next, you might notice that this area here on the rope, right, that it also feels a little bit off because, right, what is this? Are we looking at it from above or below? So that kind of confusion can also be not great. So what we want to do is to make clear once again, right, the nearer is overlapping the further, and then we want to kind of do this. Once again, we can always make it a little bit stronger to begin with, and then kind of make it a bit more subtle later on. So this is the kind of effect that I would like to have, and therefore this is sort of what we're gonna do for now. Right, and ensure this area is kept under shadow. And another important thing is, like, for example, this area here. Right, we have the right lighting for it. Maybe a little bit obscured by the rope. But generally, you should have something like a little bit of light here where it's not obscured by anything. Apologies, my voice is getting a bit soft. I've been drifting away from the microphone, so I'm back. Get a little bit closer to the mic. Yeah, and we'll just continue making corrections. For example, the top of her sleeve here, you can see like this, a little bit of a bevel. So sometimes it can be good to leave a bevel here, right? Because if you think about it, clothing in reality, they aren't like metal plates, right? They kind of have a bevel sometimes. But what I think is good is that we can introduce a mix of a bevel and a straight edge, or rather a sharp edge. So something like this, right? We can have this part of the shoulder here, right? We can have a sharp edge here, and then we can have a sharp fold like so. Give a little bit of blur here, and then a little bit of blur on the bevel towards this direction. So we indicate that the cloth is capable of sort of contouring like this, but it's also not, like a metal plate, right? It's not like a metal plate. It's super sharp. It's it can only exist in very sharp edges. No bending allowed, right? That's not a way to do it either. So these are kind of small things that we can start incorporating in our piece to sort of help clean out certain areas. Like here, right, we can see the cloth is a bit rough. We can introduce our own we can introduce a slightly smoother shape here, like so. And another concept I want to talk about is rendering, right? Sometimes we don't finish rendering something, or rather we think we finish rendering something, but it's not finished. What do I mean? For example, this area here is a curve, right? This area, this region here. This region here is a curve. So what happens when we have this curve? Well, as a result, what happens is that this area should receive different amounts of light, and that light should reflect into our eyes differently. But because the piece is quote-unquote not quite yet finished, this value here is a little bit too similar to the value here and here. So what we can do is to just make a really small indication that this area here is the brightest. That's the statement that we're making with this particular set of brushstrokes, right? And that's going to tell the viewer, that's going to tell ourselves that this area is the brightest, and then we can leave it at that. And similar to the sharp edge that we've showcased before, folds can also include sharp edges, right? Like not every fold has to be soft, or nor does every fold have to be sharp. So there's always a variety of sharp folds and smooth on soft folds is going to be good to showcase certain things. So next, moving on to this area here, right? As you can see, there's a bend in the cloth. It's a bend in the fabric because the arm is kind of taking up, forcing the fabric towards a higher angle, right? Arm is going something like this, right? So there's a bit of a bend here, or rather here. So for these areas, I like to be able to indicate them a bit more clearly. For example, making sure the silhouette of the foreshortened portion of the cloth is sort of turned like so. Right, we can even add a little bit of texture to make things a bit clearer as to what is going on. Right, we can even add a little bit of bounce lighting on the rim here to indicate that, hey, this is my territory. Right, and stuff like that is really, really helpful when we are drawing foreshortening, right? Because foreshortening can be difficult to define at times, and so we want to make sure that we are doing our best to really tell people that, hey, this area has changed in contour. Is the surface, the adjacent surfaces have facing different directions, right? Basically, and we want that message to be pretty clear as well. So something like this could be good, or something like this could be good as well. Right, really to indicate a fold, a change in the direction. Folds are easy to draw from certain angles. From other angles, you need little cues like this to help you indicate the same folds. Next, let's move on to this area here. So as you can see here, a problem here I have is with this orange wrapping, right? We're indicating that light from above is, well, stronger than the light from below. Makes perfect sense. But one way that this can appear unfinished is if this entire area here, you know, kind of maintains a completely equal brightness. For example, this area here and this area here, they are the same brightness. And these two area here and this area here, they are the same brightness. Well, that's not good because each of these areas are receiving significant, or rather visibly different levels of light. So we kind of want to account for that, right? For example, here, we want it to be a bit darker because it's covered by the sleeve. Right, it's significantly darker. We want to make the distinction between this and this clear. Right, we can even draw. You can even use lines like thick lines like this just to force the point, right? And then we can make that a bit subtle, a bit more subtle a bit later. Right. Similarly, we can also include stuff like this. We want to show that these two materials don't just fuse together, but rather intersect. So this can be very helpful. And for this area that's facing below, we can add in a component of ambient light that sort of shines out from below, right? For example, it can be bouncing off the floor, and then it hits all the way here, right? But it hits a little bit less over here, right? The most is here, a little bit less here, and very little here. So we kind of have this 1, 2, 3, 4. So now that we have the 3 separations below, this one might look a little bit weak, so we can separate out a little bit more by upping the lighting here, upping the local value here a bit more. So something like this could be good for indicating forms a bit more clearly. Similarly, right, let's say the texture here is that it's a wrapping, we can also add some lines here that follow the contour to help indicate that as well. And that is going to be really, really helpful in us telling the audience what exactly is the material that we are looking at right now. Right, and so these are little things as we see before and after, right? The difference is subtle, but it's important. And of course, I will continue painting this a little bit more on my own so that we can move on with the tutorial. So for the hand here, it's a bit rough. Let me see if I can find a layer without, yes, find a layer without the rain effects. Find the layer, yep, there we go. And so this is a layer, yeah, without the rain effects. So let's see how we can draw a hand, right? Similarly, as you can see, the hand is kind of clasping the blade or the sword. So when we're drawing hands, it's also a case of like hair, right? These are focal areas. These are areas where people pay attention to. So we kind of have to look at it and think about it more carefully, right? For example, splitting out the fingers more individually. Whereas not splitting things out unnecessarily, for example, here where the fingers kind of come together, where they are meeting the knuckles, right? This area here is not completely, or rather, this area here isn't the knuckle itself. The knuckles are here, for example, right? The knuckles are here, 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 and here. So these are the knuckles. This is kind of like the first joint of the finger, right? Because this is the, or this is the knuckle. Wait, now I'm confusing myself. Okay, a little bit of a reset. I made mistakes as well. So let's think about it again. Okay, so the knuckles are here, 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 and here. Yep, that is correct. So these are the knuckles. Right, the middle finger usually has a really prominent knuckle, and then so does the index finger. And then the rest of the fingers kind of line up. Kind of want to make a curve. So with fingers, as with lots of things, you want to make sure that you give them the right form. For example, previously, this looks like a really thick finger here. So we want to include a little bit of a side view to kind of indicate its roundness just a little bit, right? Small things like that are important. And then sometimes we want to draw folds, but we must be careful not to draw them a little bit too bright, right? Try to keep to your predefined brightnesses, as we mentioned. And things like this could be folds, right? Folds could appear like in between your fingers when you're wearing a glove and you're pulling it tight. Could be you might have experienced this yourself when wearing like a latex glove, like in a science lab or something like that. Right, and important areas like this area here, which is also receiving light, we want to pay attention to. And just in general, we want to kind of introduce maybe a certain rotation where this part of the hand is turned a little bit below, whereas here the hand is kind of rotating up. Small things like that could be also things you experiment with as you make changes, right? Because previously we may be a bit more rough, but now because we're doing things a bit more precisely, it can be a good chance to make, or rather rethink or think about certain choices that are from before, and to see if they still apply in the more current context. So things like this are pretty important. And similarly for the other sleeve, we want to repeat the same process as well. Right, once again, for areas like these bandages, it can be helpful to just use a soft brush and sort of reset the area just a little bit, right? To sort of reset the area a little bit, introduce a clearer lighting relationship, and then go back in with the contour lines. In this case, right, the bandage wrappings. And then you have a better effect on exactly where things are. You have a better idea of how things flow and stuff like that. So that is really helpful for areas where you need to maintain form and stuff like that, right? Sometimes you may not get it right on the first try. So for example, here I can use a warp tool to make small adjustments like so to get things to line up properly. We can also reinforce certain areas as we see it. For example, the shoulder here. And stuff like that. And let's move on to the next area. So now we've got the hair done, or mostly done. Let's look at the chest area. So for skin texture, many artists do it in a different way. But personally, what I like to do is to really just try to keep unnecessary forms out and keep the silhouette sort of sharp and clean. Especially in areas where there's a bunch of light, so you can see things clearly. Right, that's the sort of visual expectation that you're giving the audience, right? Like they should be seeing things clearly, and so as much as possible, we sort of want to support that. Right, we don't want to go against the idea or the rules that we are setting. So we kind of want to make sure the soft brush is there to help us even out things that are a little bit unnecessarily textured. At the same time, I like to use this toothbrush tool to add a little bit of texture right, like so, to make sure this area here isn't like untextured or completely devoid of texture. And yeah, these are some of the things that we also want to be doing. Another thing that I may have subconsciously done, or may have touched upon slightly before, is the idea of using ambient lighting. So obviously, right, in this case, we have the top lighting from above, but what we can also do is to introduce a little bit of ambient lighting from the side, right? There's a hint of it right now. We introduce a little bit of it from the side to help lighten up the forms and introduce a bit more definition into the piece. Right, not every area requires the same amount of additional lighting, so you know, do it with discretion. Right, certain areas, for example, can receive a little bit of red reflection because there's a bunch of red material below. Right, that could be helpful for making a better, you know, color scheme, or rather making a more complete color scheme and things like that. And they can also be helpful for defining forms in area where, you know, it otherwise can be difficult to draw forms, right? Because there's a lot of shadow and stuff like that. And another thing is we can take a look is that, for example, this particular sash, this sash here is drawn really kind of sloppily, unfortunately, because it's kind of an important part. It's, you know, it's in bright red and all that, but it's kind of drawn sloppily. So we want to fix that. Starting with, you know, once again, the silhouettes and the highlights, because these are the areas where the message of what form is given out the most strongly, right? So we want to make sure things are correct in these areas especially. And here, as you can see, right, this area here is kind of like floating below the sash. The sash is above this area, whereas here is kind of attached to the sash. So the idea we want to convey is that a sash is something that's pretty tight, right? It kind of wraps and binds the clothing around the character's form. So what's important is that the sash keeps to the character's form. And to do that, we kind of look at it and rethink how tight the sash should be. So for example, here I'm going to be a little bit more bold. You know, excuse me, making some further adjustments. I'm going to duplicate the character and then just take a look at this area here and think of how the waist of the character is oriented. For example, our legs of the character are facing forward while the torso is facing a little bit towards the side because of the hand. The hand is kind of pulling the torso's rotation back. So it means that this waist area is going to be kind of a hybrid between facing forward and facing forward, and therefore we're looking at its side. And it's a struggle, almost a struggle between that and it facing towards us, or rather more towards us based on the upper torso. But either way, right, for example, we can consider the waist area here can be a little bit thinner. Right, because once again, the sash is supposed to be as form-fitting as any part of this robe gets. So when we have something like a loose robe like this, the sash is the part that really kind of makes it physically possible, per se, right? Because without it, right, like what exactly is holding the character kind of in place? So these are some of the considerations that we can think of when we draw various different types of accessories, right? For example, if we're drawing something loose, it doesn't need to be form-fitting. We're drawing something a bit tighter, it needs to be more form-fitting, well, naturally. And yeah, so these are some of the adjustments, right? We are adjusting things back and forth as well, right? To take you to contour, for example, the hip area. And to ensure the tightness, or rather to show that the sash is tight on the character, you know, there shouldn't be an area below where there's cast shadow, essentially. And I want to do something like this. And then we can try something like this, right? To indicate that these areas are very much next to each other. For example, like this surface, and this surface are all very tight fitting. So they're all together here. Very little space, very little gap, maybe a little bit of gap to show the thickness of the sash itself. Because these sashes are actually really long, like belts of silk and stuff that get wrapped around, right? And so they always almost have like a soft edge to them. They're not just a single piece. And similar to the hair, right? For example, we have a piece of fabric here, the dress here, or the bottom part of the cloak or robe here that that it's kind of flowing out. So we want to indicate that it's flowing out. Recall that, as we just mentioned, only this area here needs to be sort of together, right? This area here, we can start to take a bit more liberty, right? For example, we can have the cloak or the bottom part of the robe sort of flow up like this, and that's like that's perfectly reasonable, right? As long as we make sure the shadows continue to follow the contour of the rest of the character. So something like this would be pretty reasonable, right? And then we can also add, for example, we know that the crease starts somewhere around here. We can do this sort of fanning out pattern for the crease, or if we look at it again, it's actually a bit more forward, almost somewhere like here, right? The crease is somewhere like here. So we have to rethink, right? For example, the character's leg here. Is it positioned correctly? Is it possible for this piece of cloth to be so far back? And the answer is no, then we have to make some corrections, right? So things like this are minor individually, but they add up over the course of the whole drawing, and then it can get pretty debilitating almost to a drawing if you have a lot of mistakes like this sort of accumulated together. And then we have this area here, which is the character, sort of this part of the dress sort of being tied up, the slit here kind of being tied together. So we also want to make sure to show there's a bit of tension on it. For example, a tension on it could be stuff like this, right? Where rather than just both edges just flowing in very resistance free, we can have stuff like this to show that it's being kind of pulled together. And then you want the tightness in this area to remain intact, rather than be lost to the rest of the drawing. Or, you know, I'm rambling now, to the rest of, or rather to be lost, right? Simply lost because, you know, this area looks too loose. And then, you know, what's the point of this attachment point here? And then for this, for example, we can even extend this and then make something like a area that is sewn together, for example. That could be good. And then for buckles like these are also important because these are kind of shiny, they're sharp objects, they cannot hide in the dark values, like for example fabric. So you kind of have to draw them, you know, pretty sharply as well. You need to give them their due respect. And so it's important to understand the form as well. So usually, you know, you don't get this, but you get this, right? Like one edge is usually below. And then you have something like this, where the belt kind of passes through, excuse me, and then does something like this. But remember that each, you know, portion of this is also its own values. Also, it also has its own structure. It casts its own shadows. So small details like this, right? Like for example, the belt also bulges out a little bit here, so we can kind of include that. Right, things like these are really, really important when we draw details like this, because even though we're looking at them from far away, the kind of impact they can give is really different depending on whether you drew it correctly. And these small details can be pretty important when all added together, and they can really affect how a drawing looks, whether it's finished or not. So these can be one of the things that you guys can also take note of as you draw, right? Or as you revisit your old pieces, you could look at this area and say, hey, it's unfinished. And then you can also consider, okay, so how much of an impact does it have on the feel and look of my piece because it is unfinished? And I think seeing it in that kind of light, or looking at it in that sort of way, can be pretty eye-opening, and at least it was for me, because sometimes when I look at these little details, they're kind of shocking to me as to how important they are, how big of a difference they make to whether a piece feels finished or unfinished, rather. And then as we work on these small details, as always, we can also look at it in terms of form. And then if we say, for example, okay, here is looking a bit incorrect, we can always pull out our favorite tool, the liquify tool, and then make tiny little corrections like this to push things just a bit back to place. just a little bit back into place, recall our POV where we are in the scene, and then we can make up adjustments accordingly. So it could be something like this, could be very helpful. And then maybe you could include like a couple of tears in the fabric here to make it a little bit more immersive almost. And as a bonus, right, these also act as contours or the contour markers in this area where, you know, we don't really have too many contour markers, and that could be great. Similarly, for example, the character's foot here, right, sometimes when we're rough, we tend to throw down certain lines. An important thing to take note of is that we want to separate materials out depending on what they are, right? For example, we have the strap for the sandal, which is perfectly fine. Maybe you could add a little bit of highlight to it. But then we have this sort of seam between, you know, the bandages, which isn't great, right? Because that's not quite how this area works. So rather than letting it be so prominent, we kind of want to override things a little bit, paint things as a whole. I think that's always a recurring concept, right? Especially when we're caught up with a painting. Even nowadays, right? When I caught up the painting, I stop paying attention to the piece as a whole. And then we can even rotate things to see how it looks like from this angle, what the light is coming from above, right? Where does the light go? Stuff like that. So even nowadays, as we paint a new painting, it's easy to be lost in the details, figuring out, you know, how certain areas work, and then we might, you know, misplace or neglect some smaller but equally important details, or rather ignore the big picture regionally, right? Like maybe overall we have things under control, but regionally, like for example this area here, you know, we might have some issues that we don't see immediately. And the lesson here is that, once again, right, textures are pretty easy to sort of replace and, you know, reintroduce. So don't worry about the texture, right? Because sometimes we can run into things like, okay, so the texture is a bit you know, it's really troublesome to have to redo this. I don't want to redo the texture, and stuff like that. And then you kind of stick with the form being sort of incorrect, and that is really one of the worst things you can do. You absolutely want to prioritize the texture, or rather the forms. And then if the forms are correct, the texture can be slapped on, it can be managed really, really easily. Even from scratch, even if you have to get rid of everything, it can be managed really easily. So the idea is always to prioritize form. Form is the most important. If your form is correct, if you have a good understanding of the structures involved, the physical structures involved, whatever you're drawing, you're gonna have a much easier time than someone who is not sure of those things, and just spends a lot of time, you know, desperately trying to get the texture to line up together. And I know that because, you know, sometimes, or rather, honestly, more often than I like, I'd be struggling with textures. I'll be like, hey, you know, this texture really isn't working out. You know, what's going on? I don't understand. You know, how do I draw this texture properly? And, you know, questions like that, they can be really, really challenging, and they can be pretty debilitating as well, because you just feel like the drawing can't be finished. But a lot of the times, the issue is with the form, right? If the form is incorrect, it's going to be really almost impossible for you to salvage it with texture. So similarly, when we're revisiting old pieces, a lot of mistakes can be the forms underneath, right? That could be the source of, you know, issues. That could be the source of potential mistakes, and that is where we want to target. That is where we want to, you know, change things up significantly, so that, you know, we can nip it in the bud. And then from there on, replacing the texture is a breeze. So we've done quite a good bit of work on this area of the character, right? For example, we can add in a bit of the ambient light, side lighting that we mentioned before, to sort of define the forms that are less visible. For example, this leg here is sort of hidden, so right, as much as possible, we still want to account for it. And areas here, like for example, right, we want to give it this sort of pinch effect where the robe is held back by the sash, something like this, right? So you can get a clear indication of where the sash is going, where the robes are going, and stuff like that, right? For example, this robe here, it sort of cuts down like so. So we can have something like this, right? But keep it separate from areas like this, right? So that could be where values are very important. For example, a darker black for this area could really keep the nearer leg separate from the further leg, right? For example, the lighting can be like so, right? And another portion of the overlap, for example, this portion of overlap can come here, and then this portion of the overlap comes here. And then you have the robe that's kind of like this, and then the third portion sort of comes here. And then you have the front of the robe sort of accounted for. And then on the underside of things, you have something like this, right? Where you have the other sort of shorts that a character is wearing, something like this. And now, right, as we draw this, we realize another problem. For example, this side of the hip is higher than the other side. And so we kind of want the sash, or at least there's some part of the sash to reflect that as well. So we kind of want to push this area down a little bit, this area up a little bit, to see how that works. And yep, I think that works pretty well. Or maybe we could grab it and then use a warp effect on it to see how that affects things a little bit differently. Right, like so. Right, this could be a better way to draw this form in the middle of the body. Notice that changes like this, right? Adjusting big markers in your piece, making these big changes to the big markers in your piece, that can significantly impact the read of the pose, the read of the gesture, and so that could be one of the areas that you can also look into when you're making corrections, right? Like, how do I change the gesture of the character? How do I make it, for example, more intense? And one of the ways that you can do it is to, as we just saw, change areas that are the most affected, right? Areas that are most affected being, or the areas that are most visibly affected by the gesture, like for example the sash is being pulled down almost, and then we can even have this area have the sash sort of be scrunched up, right? This area that the sash is scrunched up, and this area of the sash is a bit loose. So even like very, otherwise fixed elements like this, we can kind of manipulate them and make them, really work for us, right? And this kind of compacting and stretching, this is the really important part of drawing gesture. You need these elements all in place in order to draw a convincing gesture and a convincing pose. And we've covered quite a bit, so let's touch on the texture here, or rather the texture here. So for areas which are bright and very readable, like for example this particular emblem, what could be better than this is to kind of think about it, how do I put it? To think about it in more detail, right? Because people will expect to have more detail. So a way you can do this is to simply introduce some damage, right? Some scratches, for example. These are actually really great for emblems on clothing, because naturally, right, certain lines kind of fall apart, especially if it's sewn on. You could even describe the embroidery lines, I think that's the word, embroidery, and add texture just by using loose brushstrokes like these, both in the shadows and on the highlights. The highlights especially are sensitive to detail, so if you want to add some detail on the highlights, go right ahead, right? For example, having a single blob of highlight versus having a big blob and then a medium blob and then a couple of dots, that's going to add quite a bit to the detail or perceived detail level on this area here as well. Even for regular cloth, you can use lines like this to indicate a little bit of cloth texture, right? It doesn't have to be too strict, and if it's a rainy day, the cloth is very wet, you can even use lines like this to kind of indicate, well, the cloth being wet, the fabric is wet, right? And stuff like that. I think that is really, really helpful. That's extremely helpful for areas where you don't want to over texture, but you need some sort of indication. And let's move on to sort of this dress area of the character. This area is important because, well, despite being it far away from the face, for example, it's still important because it really comprises a big part of the character's movement, right? The character's movement is, you know, this way, right? And it's counterbalanced by this element here. So this element here, well, we need it to be, you know, very readable. We need it to be solid. We need to be, you know, able to kind of take on the burden of being something that people will, inevitably their attention will be drawn to because of the fact that it's sort of like a counterbalance. So the difficulty with flowing fabric is that sometimes, you know, after drawing all kinds of overlapping forms, it can be really confusing to know exactly where each piece is going. So one way I like to think about it is to start from one edge. For example, this particular piece of fabric, where is this going? Is this a separate piece of fabric? Perhaps in our case, we can design the costume to have separate pieces of fabric flowing from the character. You know, that's going to make our job easier because we no longer have to align, we no longer have to say, for example, account for a continuous edge, right? We don't have to account for that, right? This could just be a single standalone piece on its own, and then that would be perfectly fine. So that could be one way to look at it, right? And in this case, that would be the exact way we'll be looking at it, right? In this really simplified version, where we can have separate pieces of robe essentially taking up the rear area of the character here, right? We can introduce damage to a robe, for example, like chips in the cloth, a bit of jagged edges. Things like that are always tools that we can call upon to make use of. And then when we're done with that, right, we can look at other things like overlaps. So overlaps are just as important as they are before, because overlaps are going to be able to tell us exactly which piece is closer to us and which piece is further away from us, which is, well, once again, really important to helping us understand a volume, right, and perspective. Because if we have a shape with a piece of cloth that's nearer to us and then we have another piece that's further away from us, and we can make that relationship clear, we are kind of expanding the physical 3D world the character's in, right? Because all these things are, you know, by our drawing methods, we're showing the audience that they take up space. For example, this piece of cloth here, right, is coming towards us, right, which would not be possible if the area towards us doesn't exist. So that's great, right? We can showcase that, right? Rather than the cloth flowing flatly backwards, like a character like this, and the thing just goes back, it kind of comes towards us, right? Like this, and then it goes away like this. So we want this sort of dimension, a multi-dimensional feel to it, even though, right, we're looking at it mostly from the side. So little nuances like this, right, are really, really helpful for that purpose. So we can see how we can make this area here, for example, a significant indicator of that, you know, that 3D space, that 3D nuance. And for example, this piece over here, this could be the edge that's just flowing directly away, so we don't need to pay too much attention to that. Whereas here, it could be edges that are flowing, right? For example, we had here, and then we had here, and then we want it to flow away. So this could be the area. Once again, right, remember our textures. Textures can help us indicate direction, so we can do some textures like this, and we thought, okay, so it's flowing away, it becomes a bit clearer. For this area here, for example, rather than having it flow together, we can rotate it a little bit more even, and then just have it flow that way almost completely, right? And then we can, for example, sharpen up this particular edge here to indicate, say, you know, a hidden fold that goes underneath and then up. Right, this is important to indicate how the cloth really exists, rather than how the cloth, you know, how we think the cloth exists, right? Another thing we can do is to give it sort of more of a distinct edge, which we have determined before, or rather decided that, you know, the cloth is made up of many different pieces, and so we can actually get away with this particular method of showcasing it. So if we feel that we've gone a little bit overboard, for example, showing a piece that's just directly going off into the side or directly away from us, we can reel things back a little bit by, once again, managing the shape, right? For example, we can change the direction on the direction of the fabric to something like this, and then it feels a little bit better than before. We can give it sort of an under edge to indicate its volume, and then we can have something like this. That is, as compared to before, is a bit more indicative of where things are actually moving. Of course, right, if it feels a bit too large, we can always adjust it back. Apologies for this extra strange white mist that's also in the background. We can deal with it later, of course. And yeah, so this is how we're going to essentially repeat the process for a lot of these edges here, right? Kind of give them a bit more form, kind of make sure they follow the perspective. For example, here, we want to indicate this edge of the sleeve is this, it is kind of a separate part, right? Something like this could be helpful. For example, something here, right, as before, right, there could be chips in the cloth, there could be like little hanger-on threads, stuff like that, that can make the edges here a little bit more interesting. For example, this edge here, we can make it more interesting as well. And as always, we want to consider the form of the element that we're drawing and whether it fits in with the rest of the piece. And for areas like this, right, sometimes we think a lot about internal form, you know, where the lighting is, where the upper area is. We also neglect the silhouette. For example, you want this to be like a rope-shaped object, you know, we give it a rope-shaped silhouette. So small things like this in this piece are some things that I'm correcting now, and that could be one thing that you can look out for as well, right? In the pursuit of rendering the internal, you know, within the shape, internal forms correctly of certain elements, have you neglected, you know, just the basic silhouette? Because that can be a lot of information being that can result in a lot of information being incorrectly presented. That could really affect things on the big scale, especially if, right, your drawing is very much dependent on the silhouette to make it shine. So here, as you can see, I'm making some changes here, introducing this sort of curved pattern to the ropes that the character is wearing, and stuff like that. All right. Similarly, here we can use micro textures like these to make our case, demonstrate the texture of certain things just a little bit more, and yeah. And of course, right, we're just going to continue painting, continue rendering. Paying attention to all these small things is, you know, it's just a natural part of progression almost, right? Because when we look at some smaller elements, like for example, the shoulder here, previously we may not be able to see the mistake, but right now we can see, oh, actually the shoulder from before, let me revert to it. Let me revert to this one, right? It's like way too small. It's like, what the heck is this form, right? It doesn't make any sense. Like, you know, what is going on, right? As compared to right now, where the shoulder is, for example, exactly as it should be, right? Even at more of a relaxed angle, it's not squished into the body. Even so, you know, it has its volume, it has its form, and it needs to be represented accurately for things to work out. And last but not least, you know, we can also work on big things, like, for example, as a mistake that I just spotted here is the shoulder here, and the elbow is here. It's like, well, you know, that's a little bit long, right? Because if we just look at a commonly, you know, cited example of shoulder to waist, you know, shoulder to waist is only about this long. And if we rotate that, my goodness, right? Elbow is really, really far away. And so, once again, Liquify is here to save the day. So what I'm going to do is to sort of push the elbow back. We want the arm to continue to be flat out, but I want to push the elbow back. For example, we want to adjust the contour lines on the character's arm, like so. But we want to make sure that we push things back reasonably. So something like this, I think, is a pretty good degree of change that we can implement. For this particular thing, for this particular area to make a bit more sense. So returning back to the head area, one thing I did notice is, for example, the front of the mask, or rather the nose area of the mask, feels a little bit too, you know, out of perspective. So we can kind of change it a little bit like this to see how that works. Yeah, and actually a lot of the issue is from this other half of the lip area here that we can sort of shave away. And then, you know, the face is also looking much better and much sharper. And overall, for example, we can reduce the size of the head just by a little bit because of how much space the hair is taking up. And once again, right, if you think about hair as, really just strands coming out from various points across the scalp, the top area here shouldn't be quite as long as the bottom area, and depending on where they reach, especially given the character's forward sort of tilt, right? So taking into account the forward tilt and then not taking into account the forward tilt. So these are some areas that perhaps we could look into improving. Oh, excuse me. Making an adjustment like this. And then continuing to think about stuff like increasing the form here. For example, right, like this element here, we could give her sort of like an emblem on the forehead, like almost as part of a mask rather than more of a bandana. All these are options that we can consider. And I think this is also important, or rather interesting part of revisiting old pieces, right? You can always inject new ideas, upgrade old ideas to make them more interesting. And yeah, it's really just up to you to have fun, right? This is one of the things that I genuinely like to have fun with, because it's so relaxing as compared to making a new piece, right? Like everything has to be up to standard, and it's like when reworking an old piece, as long as we make it a little bit better than before, right, it's a win. So I'm happy. And yeah, we're getting pretty close to the end of this demo. I think we've been talking for quite a bit. I've also really taken this chance to show a bit more direct painting, how I like to approach things, as many people have requested. Sometimes I just find it difficult to always be drawing live, and yeah, but since everyone do enjoy this sort of more less structured, more informal type of talking and painting, I think this episode should be a pretty interesting one. I think I've showed you guys how you could, right, for example, start on correcting some of your older paintings, and helping them unleash their full potential per se. I think that will be really fun, and hopefully you guys will give it a try as well. I will continue to work on this piece, and yeah, and ideally I would be able to deliver it to you guys next month. Plus, do check out the announcement that I have just made, and yeah. So this is about it for this tutorial. I've been talking for quite a while, and once again, thank you so much for watching. And I know these kind of demos are always not not exhaustive. So if you have any specific questions, please, as always, feel free to ask them in the comments below. And once again, thank you so much for all your support here on Patreon. It really means a lot. I'm very much looking forward to getting back into the swing of things once I'm fully back. So please do look forward to new works that will be coming out. So once again, thank you for your support, and I hope to see you next month.